Before the command even comes, we're told the love that we are to have is not a love toward a set of rules or a principle or an ethic. It's a love to a person. And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, asked him, "Which commandment is the most important of all?" Jesus answered, "The most important is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." And the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other besides him. And to love him with all the heart and all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered him wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one dared to ask him any further questions. As we come to this passage, I mentioned just a moment ago the uniqueness of the passage. No other passage portrays a scribe in anything like a positive light. But not only that, this passage, I think, is uniquely convicting. I'm not sure that there is another passage in our New Testaments that is this convicting, at least not for me. I struggled a great deal this week to prepare this message just because of the fact that this is a tremendously convicting message for me personally. I pray that as we all listen to this message, we will all share in the conviction of the reality of what this passage has to say to us. And so now, with that being said, let's begin here in verse 28 and let's dive in from verse 28. "And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another." So here we have now the third group of people, or category of people, so to speak, that are coming to Jesus with questions. First was the Pharisees, now is the Sadducees, and now the scribe. We remind ourselves of what the scribes were. The scribes, in Matthew's passage, is referred to as a lawyer, and that's what a scribe was. A scribe was a professional person who was trained in the interpretation of the law. They were not only trained, and they were skilled in the interpretation of the law, and that was their occupation. In Matthew's Gospel, the parallel passage in chapter 22, it describes the situation in which the Pharisees see how Jesus has put to shame, or literally the word that Matthew uses there is muzzled the Sadducees. So think back to the previous week. As Jesus answers the Sadducees, remember the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, and they come to Jesus with this question about the resurrection, and Jesus answers so resolutely and so soundly that the Pharisees, who believe in the resurrection and who are the enemies of the Sadducees, they hear this and they're glad to hear it. And our passage says that the scribes heard him disputing with one another and seeing that he answered them well. Or as Matthew says, seeing that he muzzled them. So in Matthew's passage, it describes this scribe as a lawyer of the Pharisees. There's no contradiction there between Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel. A scribe was an occupation. And a scribe could be also affiliated with other groups of people. Most often the scribes were affiliated with the Pharisees, but they could just be affiliated with other groups as well. So no contradiction here. Here's a Pharisee. He's affiliated with the group of the Pharisees, but by occupation, he is a scribe. He's a scribe of the Pharisees. And this group of Pharisees hear how Jesus has shamed, so to speak, the Sadducees with his answer. And hearing that they answer him well, they send, or this particular scribe goes on his own to now ask another question of Jesus. This is the only situation in which an individual comes to ask Jesus a question instead of a group. So the single scribe comes to him, and in Matthew's gospel, he comes and asks this question. Matthew's specific to tell us that he asks the question to test Jesus. In the flow of the dialogue, it's going to become obvious to us that this is not a hostile dialogue. This is a friendly, amiable dialogue. And particularly in Jesus' conclusion after hearing the scribe's answer, this is not something that we would see as the typical hostile confrontation with Jesus. Nevertheless, Matthew says that they asked this in order to test Jesus. So we put those two together and we see perhaps the Pharisees continuing to want to test Jesus, continuing to try to get something on Jesus that they may accuse him of. Nevertheless, there's one of the Pharisees who tends to view Jesus favorably. Perhaps this is one of the Pharisees that later on in Acts, the book of Acts, we're going to read that many of the Pharisees believed upon Christ after he had risen. So perhaps he's one of those. But in any case, the Pharisees still see an opportunity, and although this individual scribe, is not hostile to Jesus, nevertheless, he goes to ask a question. Perhaps they're listening in to hear what they might overhear in order to hold this against Jesus. So he comes and he heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he, meaning Jesus, answered them, meaning the Sadducees, answered them well, he then asks him this question. And then the question comes, which is the most important commandment of all? Now, in asking this question, this was not something unusual. This would have been a very typical question of the day. We read that it was a very commonplace thing for people to ask popular rabbis or sages or teachers to ask them a question phrased just like this. Of all the commands, which is the greatest? Which is the most important? He says, which is the most important commandment of all? Our English Standard translates that most important. If you're in the King James, it'll say something like the first commandment. It's just the word proto, from which we get our word or our prefix like prototype, first type. So he says, what's the first commandment? Not meaning the first one in order. The first commandment would have been, you may eat of any tree of the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So he doesn't mean the first commandment in order. He means the most important, as our English Standard translates. What's the greatest, the highest, the most important question? And as we said, that's a typical type of question that would be asked of rabbis or teachers. Just categorize all the things that we're supposed to do. Can you categorize them for us and sort of give us an idea what's the most important one for us to follow, which is the most important commandment of all? So a couple of interesting things about the Greek there that aren't necessary in order to understand the passage, but perhaps they'll shed a little additional light on it for us and help us to really perceive the flavor of the question. First of all, which commandment is the most important of all? That word all there, in the English, it reads to us as though all is modifying or describing commandment. As if to say, of all the commandments, which commandment is the one that's most important of all? But scholars tell us that word all is not modifying or describing the word commandment. Instead, it's a generic word that is describing, well, I'll put it this way. The question really is not so much asking of all the commandments, which one is the most important. What it's asking is, of all the requirements upon all of humanity, what's the greatest requirement upon humanity? So it's not necessarily asking, what should the Jew obey most of all? What should the Israelite obey most of all? Of all those commandments that we have, which of those should we be obeying most of all? Instead, what it's asking is, of all of mankind, what's the most important thing for us to be doing? So of all these commandments, which commandment is the most important of all? So that's the one thing that helps us to kind of see the flavor. Another thing here is that the question as it's asked, again, as it comes through in the English, it sounds as though that the scribe is asking, tell me which commandment should be held above all the others. But instead, it would be more literally or more precisely translated, what sort of command is the greatest of all? What kind, what category of command is the greatest? You see, the Jewish mind thought of the commands of God is in two categories. Of all these commandments in the Old Testament, some 613 we're told, commandments in the Old Testament. Of all those commandments, the Jew thought of those commandments in two categories. You've heard me say before that I think it's best to think of those in three categories. One is the commandments of the moral law. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. Another is the category of civil law, how Israel as a nation was to govern themselves. And then the third category is the ceremonial law. But Israel, being a theocracy, they didn't separate civil law from moral law, so to speak. So all that to say is that the Jew separated the commandments into two categories, the ceremonial law and the ethical law. So the ethical law, do not murder, don't steal from your neighbor, don't covet. The ceremonial law governs the Sabbath, the sacrifices, the dietary laws, all the ceremonial practices that took place. And so the question really was a question that was asking Jesus, of these two categories of law, which category is most important for mankind? Which category is it most important that humans obey? Is it the category of ceremonial law, or is it the category of ethical law? We wouldn't have to think about that. We would answer, certainly everyone can understand the most important category is the category of ethical law. However, we are not ancient Jews. And this is why it's important for us to do the sometimes hard work of understanding the Scriptures through the lens of the culture that they were given to. In Jesus' culture, the far and away predominant view was that the more important category was the ceremonial law. That was the most binding and most important category of laws to not only to the Jew, but to all people. And so to ask the average Jew on the street in Jesus' day, is the ceremonial law or the ethical law more important? They would have answered, well, clearly the ceremonial law. This is manifested most clearly in the Pharisees. This helps to explain for us why it was that so often we come across these incidents in which the Pharisees lose their minds over an apparent violation of the ceremonial law. So think with me of just the instances in which they lose their mind over Jesus healing a man's hand on the Sabbath. Or they go berserk over Jesus' Pharisees plucking a few heads of grain on the Sabbath. This explains something to us about why it was that they seemed to take those ceremonial laws so seriously to the degree that they could literally just almost seemingly do away with the ethical laws. Let the man's hand remain withered. Just don't violate the Sabbath. You see? So the Pharisee, along with most of Jews, would have immediately answered the ceremonial law is the category that's most important. But notice Jesus is not going to answer it in that way. In fact, he's not even going to answer which category. He's going to go to a specific commandment. Now, as we think forward to the scribe's response, his response is going to indicate to us that perhaps he too was of the opinion, as Jesus' opinion, that it's not the ceremonial law. In fact, that's what he's going to basically say, that it's not the ceremonial law that's most important, it's the ethical side of the law. So this would, if this is true, this would put the scribe in sort of a minority category of people who viewed the ethical law of God as something that supersedes the ceremonial type law. So he answers this question, which commandment is the most important of all? Verse 29, Jesus answered. And you get the sense here, don't you, that there's no hesitation. Jesus didn't have to stop and think. Oh, let me sort of ponder on that a little bit. Of all 613 laws, which one? Let me think. Okay, let me go with this one. Instead, it's like a reflex reaction, isn't it? Like you hit the kneecap and the foot goes forward. It's just this reflex immediately. Jesus has his answer already prepared. Clearly, the most important command is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Boom, there's the answer, clear and straightforward. So in answering the question, Jesus is going to quote from what you probably heard of as the Shema. The Shema is a passage of Scripture found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. That word Shema is just the Hebrew word for hear, H-E-A-R. That was the typical method of referring to biblical passages for the ancient Jew. They would refer to the passage by the first word of the passage. In fact, just as on a side note, that's why many of your Old Testament books are named what they're named, because the name of the book is the first word in the Hebrew text, like Genesis. But that's a side note. So the first word of the passage is hear. Hear, O Israel. And so he's referring to this passage known as the Shema. Now the Shema was made up of this passage and then put together with this passage two other passages, a lengthier passage later in Deuteronomy and a lengthy passage in Numbers. Those three passages would be recited twice daily by the Jew, every morning, every evening. So think for just a moment. of just how many thousands and thousands and thousands of times the Jew has heard these passages recited and recited these passages themselves. This would have been something akin to the Lord's Prayer for us, or the Apostles' Creed for us, or something so foundational, so fundamental, that it would be something that they recite daily, even twice daily. So he answers in this quotation from Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." So as he quotes this, he is going to indicate for us, as he quotes from the Shema, the beginning of the Shema says this, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The Shema is this command that Jesus is going to tell us is the most binding command on humankind. But the command begins with this statement of the uniqueness and the unity of God. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So here and there, sort of the unity, the Lord our God is one, but you also hear the uniqueness, or maybe you don't hear the uniqueness, but someone who does hear that is the scribe. Because look at his answer. His answer, he reiterates or he restates what Jesus said. He says in verse 32, "You are right, teachers, you have truly said that He is one, and there is no other besides Him." Now, the scribe is not adding information to the Shema. He's not adding something to what Jesus says. He is restating what Jesus said. He is stating what the Jew understood the Shema to be saying, which is a statement that begins with the uniqueness, with the unity, with the personality of God the Father. The Lord our God is one. That's going to be helpful as we think about the command that is to follow. The command that is to follow, we all know, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You cannot love an idea with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You cannot love a universal force with all your heart, mind, and strength. You cannot love a universal principle. You cannot love a universal ethic with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You can love a person with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so it's important to see that before the command even comes, we're told the love that we are to have is not a love toward a set of rules or a principle or an ethic. It's a love to a person. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Not a person as a human person, but a person, the person of God. The Lord our God, the Lord is one.